In the heart of Eastwood, where justice was supposed to protect the vulnerable and punish the guilty, a single moment of arrogance threatened to unravel it all. A black federal judge, Ethan Carter, walked confidently through the streets, only to be seen as a threat by a man who had spent decades abusing his badge. Victor Hayes, the city's once untouchable police chief, made a snap decision, fueled by prejudice, one that would not only shatter his own life but also expose the deep cracks in the system he represented. What happens when two men, one wielding power through fear and the other through justice, collide in a battle that will change a city forever? In the clash of authority and accountability, the truth becomes a weapon, and justice is no longer blind. Before we dive into this gripping story of justice, betrayal, and redemption, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're excited to see how this tale unfolds, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one. The city of Eastwood stood as a paradox, a mix of towering skyscrapers in its heart and neglected neighborhoods on its outskirts. Once a beacon of opportunity, Eastwood had become a mirror of social inequality. Underneath its bustling streets and busy courtrooms simmered a reality of systemic prejudice. For the marginalized, especially those in the city's black communities, justice was often a promise unfulfilled. Among the city's most prominent figures was Ethan Carter, a 46-year-old federal judge known for his unshakable commitment to fairness and integrity. Ethan's journey to his esteemed position was anything but ordinary. Born and raised in Northside, one of Eastwood's most disadvantaged neighborhoods, he had fought through a maze of prejudice and poverty. Despite the odds, Ethan had excelled, fueled by an unrelenting belief in justice. By the age of 30, he was not just a judge, but a symbol of hope for many who shared his struggles. Ethan's character was shaped by his environment and by his steadfast sense of purpose. He often walked through Eastwood streets after work, reminding himself of where he came from and connecting with the community. His gray suits and poised demeanor symbolized his rise, yet he remained grounded, understanding the persistent weight of discrimination. On the opposite end of the spectrum was Victor Hayes, the city's police chief, a man notorious for his heavy-handed methods and deep-seated biases. Victor, in his late 50s, had spent decades climbing the ranks of law enforcement, but not through compassion or fairness. Instead, he had built his career on fear, control, and an unshakable belief in maintaining the natural order of power. For Victor, the world was divided into two groups, those who wielded authority and those who were meant to be controlled. He viewed the growing success of individuals like Ethan as anomalies, blips in an otherwise predictable system. To Victor, a black man in a position of power challenged the status quo he had spent years upholding. He hid his disdain behind a cold, professional exterior, but his actions often betrayed him. Their lives were bound to cross paths, two forces on opposite sides of the justice system. Ethan, the reformist striving to make the system fairer, and Victor, the enforcer who weaponized his badge, were destined to collide. The clash would expose not just their differences, but also the cracks in a system built to protect some and oppress others. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan wrapped up an informal meeting with colleagues downtown. The sun cast a warm glow over the city's streets as he decided to walk home, savoring the rare moment of peace. Dressed in his usual gray suit, he moved with a quiet confidence that often drew admiration. For Ethan, these walks were not merely about exercise or reflection. They were a way of remaining connected to the people whose lives his courtroom decisions often impacted. Meanwhile, Victor Hayes patrolled the streets in his police cruiser, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. For Victor, power wasn't just a tool, it was his identity. He thrived on the respect and fear his position commanded. As he drove through Eastwood's mixed neighborhoods, he felt a sense of ownership over the streets, viewing their residents as subjects under his control. It was during this patrol that Victor first spotted Ethan. Standing at a street corner in front of a cafe, Ethan's polished suit and upright demeanor struck a discordant note in Victor's mind. To Victor, there was no logical explanation for a black man dressed like Ethan to be in this part of town unless he was up to something. His suspicions, fueled by bias rather than evidence, began to take shape. Who does he think he is? Victor muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. He pulled his cruiser to a halt near the cafe, stepping out with the deliberate authority that had become his signature. As he adjusted his badge, he made his way toward Ethan, each step heavy with judgment. The tension in the air was palpable even to passers-by, who slowed their pace to observe the unfolding encounter. "Hey you!" Victor called out, his voice echoing through the street. Ethan turned to face the officer, his expression calm but curious. He had encountered situations like this before and knew better than to react rashly. "Yes, officer?" Ethan responded, his tone polite but firm. Victor's eyes narrowed as he sized up Ethan. "What are you doing here? This doesn't seem like the kind of place for someone like you." The words dripped with condescension, but Ethan held his composure. "I'm just waiting for someone," he replied, his voice measured. Victor let out a dry chuckle, the sound devoid of humor. "Waiting for trouble, more like," he shot back, his hand already hovering near his handcuffs. "People like you don't usually wander into neighborhoods like this without a reason." The interaction began to draw more onlookers, their curiosity mingled with unease. Ethan knew the power dynamics at play and chose not to escalate the situation. But the humiliation in his eyes was evident. Before Ethan could respond further, Victor grabbed his arm, turning him roughly toward the wall. The cold metal of handcuffs locked around Ethan's wrists as Victor declared, "You're under arrest." "For what?" Ethan asked, his voice calm despite the rising indignation inside him. "For looking suspicious," Victor sneered, tightening the cuffs unnecessarily. The smug satisfaction on his face was unmistakable as he led Ethan toward the police cruiser. As the door slammed shut behind him, Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, his thoughts racing. He could feel the weight of humiliation bearing down on him, but he knew this was only the beginning. Despite Victor's arrogance, Ethan understood that the truth was on his side, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. The city bustled around them as Victor Hayes slammed the door of his cruiser shut, leaving Ethan Carter handcuffed in the back seat. The low murmur of passers-by grew louder, their expressions ranging from shocked to indifferent. Some pulled out their phones to record the scene, while others quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. The tension in the air was unmistakable, but Victor seemed oblivious, drunk on the control he believed he had over the situation. Victor glanced back at Ethan through the rearview mirror as he started the car. "So, boss," he said, the sarcasm in his tone cutting through the silence, "you gonna tell me what you were really doing back there? That fancy suit of yours doesn't fool me." Ethan met Victor's gaze in the mirror, his calm demeanor unshaken. He didn't answer. He had nothing to prove to this man. Silence, Ethan knew, often spoke louder than words. Victor interpreted Ethan's lack of response as a challenge, his face tightening with irritation. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" Victor spat, turning his eyes back to the road. "Walking around in that suit, acting like you belong in this city. Let me tell you something. People like you don't belong anywhere near here." Ethan shifted his gaze out the window, watching the streets of Eastwood pass by. He saw familiar sights, shops he had frequented as a child, and streets he had walked when he had nothing but dreams of escaping his circumstances. Yet now, these same streets looked different. From the backseat of a police cruiser, they seemed smaller, suffocating. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a federal judge who had dedicated his life to justice, being treated like a common criminal simply because of the color of his skin. Ethan wasn't new to racial profiling. He had experienced it in various forms throughout his life. But this felt different, more personal, more deliberate. Victor, meanwhile, reveled in the authority he thought he had over Ethan. To him, this was just another routine arrest, another statistic to pad his record. He didn't stop to question whether his actions were justified or even lawful. To Victor, Ethan's presence in that neighborhood, dressed as he was reason enough. When they arrived at the police station, Victor dragged Ethan out of the car, his grip firm and unyielding. The murmurs among the bystanders turned into whispers of disbelief. Ethan, with his polished appearance and composed demeanor, didn't fit the typical image of someone being hauled into custody. Victor led Ethan through the station, ignoring the curious glances of his colleagues. He pushed Ethan into a small, dimly lit interrogation room, the metal chair inside cold and uninviting. As Victor removed the handcuffs, he tightened them one last time as if to assert his dominance. Ethan rubbed his wrists, the physical pain minor compared to the symbolic weight of the situation. Victor sat across from Ethan, his notebook in hand, pretending to prepare for a formal interrogation. But Ethan could see through the act. This wasn't about following protocol, it was about control. Victor wanted to break him, to prove to himself and anyone watching that he was in charge. "So," Victor began, flipping through the empty notebook as if it contained vital information, "let's start with your name. Or are you one of those people who think they're too important to answer questions?" Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, his expression calm but resolute. "You didn't ask for my name when you arrested me," he replied, his voice measured. "Why start now?" Victor's jaw tightened, the smugness on his face faltering for a brief moment. "Funny guy, huh?" he said, leaning forward. "Let me tell you how this works. You're in my station now. You answer my questions, or things are going to get a lot worse for you." Ethan didn't flinch. "I know exactly how this works," he said, his tone unwavering. "Better than you, I'm sure." Victor's face reddened, his frustration growing. He was used to people cowering under his authority, not meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. Ethan's composure was unnerving, but Victor refused to let it show. Before the exchange could continue, a sharp sound broke through the tension. The ring of Victor's phone. He picked it up impatiently, his irritation evident. "What?" he barked into the receiver. The voice on the other end was firm, cutting through Victor's bravado like a blade. "Chief Hayes, release the man you just brought in. Immediately." Victor froze, the color draining from his face. "What? Why?" he stammered, the confidence in his voice replaced by uncertainty. The voice on the phone didn't waver. "Do you have any idea who that man is? He's Judge Ethan Carter, a federal judge. If you know what's good for you, you'll let him go right now." Victor's hand tightened around the phone as he glanced at Ethan, who was watching him with an inscrutable expression. Panic began to creep into Victor's chest, but he tried to maintain his composure. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "You should have asked," the voice replied coldly. "Fix this, Hayes. Now." Victor hung up the phone, his mind racing. He stood and began pacing the room, the arrogance that had defined him just moments ago, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He looked at Ethan, who remained seated, calm and collected. "Who are you?" Victor finally asked, his voice trembling. Ethan raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I thought you knew." Victor shook his head, his frustration mounting. He had made a catastrophic mistake, one that was about to unravel his career and reputation. He left the room abruptly, slamming the door behind him. In the hallway, Victor paced back and forth, his thoughts a whirlwind of panic and regret. How could he have been so reckless? Ethan wasn't just anyone. He was a man with power, connections, and influence. Victor had spent his entire career abusing his authority, but this time, he had gone too far. Back in the interrogation room, Ethan sat alone, his calm demeanor unwavering. He knew the tide was turning. The humiliation he had endured was nothing compared to what was about to befall Victor. Justice, Ethan understood, sometimes required patience. Inside the dim interrogation room, Ethan Carter sat motionless, his hands resting on the cold metal table. Despite the degrading arrest and the tight handcuffs that had left red marks on his wrists, his calm demeanor remained unshaken. The humiliation he had endured was undeniable, but his silence spoke volumes. Ethan knew the system all too well, and he understood the importance of timing. Speaking prematurely would not serve him. It was Victor Hayes who now had everything to lose. Bookmark, go back. Outside the room, Victor paced the hallway, beads of sweat forming on his brow. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by panic and uncertainty. He replayed the phone call in his head, the authoritative voice warning him about the magnitude of his mistake. "Judge Ethan Carter," the voice had said, each syllable cutting through Victor's bravado like a knife. How could he have missed such an important detail? Victor glanced back at the door to the interrogation room, his heart pounding. For years, he had wielded his authority like a weapon, confident that the system would always protect him. But this time was different. Ethan Carter wasn't just another nameless face. He was a man with influence, connections, and a reputation that far surpassed Victor's. Taking a deep breath, Victor adjusted his badge and re-entered the room. Ethan didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the table. The silence between them was deafening, the tension palpable. Victor pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down, his earlier confidence replaced by a forced casualness that didn't suit him. "Look," Victor began, his voice tight, "we may have gotten off on the wrong foot here. How about we start over?" Ethan finally raised his eyes, meeting Victor's gaze with a calm intensity that made the police chief shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Start over?" Ethan repeated, his voice steady. "Interesting choice of words, considering I was handcuffed and thrown into a squad car without so much as being asked my name." Victor swallowed hard, struggling to find a response. The power dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically, and he felt it. Ethan's composed demeanor only magnified Victor's unease. "Well," Victor stammered, "maybe things escalated a bit. I was just doing my job, you understand. You looked out of place." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Out of place?" he said, his tone measured. "And what exactly does that mean, Chief Hayes?" Victor hesitated, the weight of the question hanging in the air. He had no good answer, and he knew it. "Look," he said again, his frustration bubbling to the surface, "I didn't know who you were, okay? If I had known, this wouldn't have happened." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, his calm mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of incredulity. "So it's acceptable to humiliate and arrest someone without cause, as long as they're not a federal judge?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but quickly realized there was no justification that wouldn't incriminate him further. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of activity outside the room. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Tell me, Chief Hayes, how many others have you treated this way? How many people have you handcuffed and humiliated without asking their name or their story?" Victor's face flushed, his composure cracking under the weight of Ethan's words. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, the excuse sounding weak even to his own ears. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to judge and degrade. What you did to me wasn't about justice, it was about power. And now, Chief Hayes, you're about to find out what happens when that power is abused." Victor sat back, his confidence fully eroded. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. Ethan's words had struck a nerve, forcing Victor to confront the reality he had long ignored. The door to the interrogation room opened abruptly, breaking the charged silence. Andrew Bennett, a prominent civil rights attorney and Ethan's longtime friend, walked in. Andrew was a tall, imposing figure, his presence commanding attention the moment he entered the room. "Ethan," Andrew said, his voice calm but firm, "are you all right?" Ethan nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I'm fine, Andrew. Just another day in Eastwood, apparently." Andrew turned his attention to Victor, his sharp eyes narrowing as he assessed the man before him. "Chief Hayes, I assume you know who I am," he said, his tone laced with authority. Victor nodded reluctantly, his mouth dry. Everyone in Eastwood knew Andrew Bennett, the attorney who had built his career on holding law enforcement accountable. "Good," Andrew continued. "Then you'll understand that what happened here today isn't going to disappear quietly. You unlawfully detained a federal judge, subjected him to public humiliation, and violated his civil rights. This isn't just a misunderstanding, Chief Hayes. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen." Victor's face turned a shade paler, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He opened his mouth to respond, but Andrew raised a hand, cutting him off. "Save it," Andrew said curtly. "Anything you say from this point forward will only make things worse. I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to explain this to your superiors and to the press." At the mention of the press, Victor's stomach dropped. The last thing he needed was public scrutiny, especially over something this egregious. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was now hanging by a thread. Ethan stood, his movements deliberate and composed. "Thank you, Andrew," he said, his voice calm. "But I think Chief Hayes needs a moment to reflect on what's just happened. Don't you agree?" Andrew smiled faintly, nodding. "I do." Victor watched in silence as Ethan and Andrew walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in around him, the weight of his actions pressing down like a vice. For the first time, Victor Hayes understood what it felt like to be powerless. As the door clicked shut behind Ethan and Andrew, Victor buried his face in his hands. He had made a catastrophic mistake, and there was no undoing it. The road ahead was clear. His actions would have consequences, and this time there was no escaping them. Victor Hayes sat frozen in the interrogation room, his hands trembling slightly as he replayed the events of the last hour. His mind raced with scenarios, each one darker than the last. This wasn't supposed to happen. Victor was used to controlling every situation, but this was spiraling out of control. He could already see the headlines, the questions, the fallout. The same power that had shielded him for decades now felt like a weight, dragging him toward inevitable ruin. Outside, the atmosphere in the police station had shifted. Whispers and sideways glances spread among the officers as word of the incident traveled. Ethan Carter wasn't just another detainee. He was a federal judge, and now the eyes of Eastwood, and likely beyond, would be on them. In the hallway, Ethan stood alongside Andrew Bennett, both men exuding a quiet but unrelenting determination. Andrew's reputation as a civil rights attorney preceded him, and his presence alone was enough to unsettle the officers who passed by. The tension in the air was thick, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't going to end quietly. Andrew turned to Ethan, his voice low but firm. "I've already made some calls. The press will be here soon, and I've got a team preparing the legal paperwork. This isn't just about you, Ethan. This is about making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know," he replied, "but this isn't just about setting an example for Victor Hayes. It's about the system that allowed someone like him to thrive." Andrew's eyes softened slightly. "We'll address the system," he assured Ethan. "But first, we make sure Hayes faces the consequences of his actions." As they spoke, Victor finally emerged from the interrogation room, his usual swagger replaced by a hesitant shuffle. His gaze darted between Ethan and Andrew, searching for a way to salvage the situation. "Judge Carter," Victor began, his voice unsteady. I think we can resolve this without making it a bigger issue. Maybe we could talk, find some common ground?" Andrew stepped forward, his towering presence cutting Victor off. "Chief Hayes," he said, his voice cold and precise, "you don't seem to understand the gravity of what you've done. This isn't something that can be smoothed over with a handshake and an apology. You violated Judge Carter's rights in a public and humiliating way. The damage is done." Victor's jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "But I didn't know who he was." "And that's the problem," Ethan interjected, his tone sharp but controlled. "You didn't care to know. You saw a black man in a suit and decided that was reason enough to act. If I weren't a federal judge, would we even be having this conversation? Or would I just be another name in your arrest record, another statistic in your so-called fight for order?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Ethan's question hung in the air, and its truth was undeniable. Before the conversation could continue, the station's main doors burst open, and a flood of reporters entered, cameras flashing and microphones raised. The hum of voices grew louder as they jockeyed for position, eager to capture the story that was rapidly gaining traction. Victor's face paled as he turned to the crowd, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just a professional mistake, it was a public scandal. He could already hear the accusations: abuse of power, racial profiling, corruption. The very foundation of his career was beginning to crumble beneath him. Ethan and Andrew exchanged a glance, their unspoken understanding clear. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment when the light of public scrutiny would shine on the injustices that had been allowed to fester in Eastwood for far too long. One of the reporters, a young woman with a sharp voice, stepped forward, her microphone aimed squarely at Victor. "Chief Hayes," she began, "is it true that you unlawfully detained Judge Ethan Carter earlier today? Can you explain the circumstances of the arrest?" Victor hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He glanced at Ethan, who stood silently, his presence alone a reminder of the gravity of the situation. Another reporter chimed in, their tone more pointed. Chief Hayes, do you believe racial profiling played a role in your decision to arrest Judge Carter? How do you respond to allegations of systemic racism within your department? The floodgates had opened, and there was no stopping the tide of questions. Victor raised his hands defensively, his voice shaky as he tried to respond. I can't comment on an ongoing investigation, he said, his words doing little to stem the growing tide of criticism. Meanwhile, Andrew stepped forward, addressing the crowd with the confidence of someone who knew the system inside and out. What happened today is a clear example of abuse of power, he said, his voice steady but firm. Judge Carter was arrested without cause, subjected to public humiliation, and treated as though his rights didn't matter. This isn't just about one man's actions, it's about a system that allows this behavior to go unchecked. The reporters turned their attention to Ethan, their questions now directed at him. Judge Carter, how do you feel about what happened today? Do you believe this incident reflects a larger problem in law enforcement? Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. What happened to me today is something that happens to countless others who don't have the platform or resources to fight back, he said, his voice measured but firm. This isn't just about me, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I went through. The crowd murmured in agreement, their cameras capturing every word. Ethan's composure and eloquence only underscored the injustice of what had happened, further isolating Victor in the court of public opinion. As the reporters continued to press for answers, Victor retreated to the safety of his office, his mind racing with fear and regret. He had spent years cultivating an image of authority and control, but now that image was shattered. Back in the main hall, Ethan and Andrew stood side by side, their determination unshaken. The fight wasn't over, but the first blow had been struck. The system that had allowed Victor to thrive was beginning to buckle under the weight of its own corruption. For Ethan, this wasn't just about his personal vindication. It was about exposing the truth and forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. And as the cameras continued to flash and the reporters fired their questions, he knew one thing for certain. Justice was just getting started. Victor Hayes sat in his office, his head in his hands, the muffled chatter of the reporters outside still audible through the walls. His once unshakable confidence had been replaced with dread as the weight of his actions settled fully on him. The realization that he had unlawfully detained a federal judge, someone with influence, connections, and a spotless reputation, gnawed at him like a relentless tide. Just hours earlier, Victor had felt completely in control. To him, Ethan Carter was just another face, another person to be put in their place. But now, the revelation of Ethan's true identity was tearing apart Victor's carefully constructed facade of power. His every decision that day had been a miscalculation, one that was now unraveling his career, his reputation, and potentially his freedom. Meanwhile, in the police station's main hall, the tension continued to build as reporters peppered questions at both Andrew Bennett and Ethan Carter. Ethan remained calm, his every word measured and deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaos Victor had left in his wake. Judge Carter, one reporter called out, what would you say to those who argue that this was an isolated incident, not reflective of systemic issues in law enforcement? Ethan paused, the weight of the question hanging in the air. This incident is a reflection of a much larger problem, he replied, his voice steady but resolute. Chief Hayes acted the way he did because he believed he could. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was the result of a system that has long enabled and protected behavior like his. If today's events can shine a light on that, then it's a step toward accountability. As the crowd murmured in agreement, Victor's office door creaked open and he stepped into the hallway, his expression grim. His earlier attempts to maintain control had crumbled, leaving him visibly shaken. The reporters immediately turned their attention to him, their cameras and microphones closing in like a pack of wolves. Chief Hayes, one of them shouted, do you have anything to say about Judge Carter's statement? How do you respond to allegations of racial profiling? Victor raised his hands in a weak attempt to fend off the barrage of questions. I can't comment right now, he muttered, his voice barely audible above the commotion. He turned away, retreating toward the station's exit, but his path was blocked by the arrival of a new figure, Marcus Delaney, Eastwood's police commissioner. Marcus was a seasoned officer in his late 60s with a reputation for being firm but fair. His graying hair and sharp eyes gave him an air of authority that commanded respect. As he stepped into the station, the room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "Chief Hayes," Marcus said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. "A word, please." Victor hesitated, his face paling further as he realized there was no escaping what was coming next. He followed Marcus into a nearby conference room, the door closing behind them. Inside, Marcus wasted no time getting to the point. "What the hell were you thinking?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising for the first time. "Detaining a federal judge without cause? Humiliating him in public? Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you've unleashed?" Victor stammered, his words fumbling over themselves. "I didn't know he was a judge. I thought—" "That's exactly the problem," Marcus interrupted, his tone icy. "You didn't know. You didn't care to know. You saw a black man in a suit and assumed the worst. And now we're all paying the price for your arrogance." Victor sank into a chair, his head bowed. "I made a mistake," he muttered. "No," Marcus said sharply. "A mistake is spilling coffee on your paperwork. What you did was an abuse of power, plain and simple. And now you're going to face the consequences." Back in the main hall, Ethan and Andrew watched as the tension in the station reached its peak. They could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that something significant was happening, not just for them but for the city as a whole. Andrew leaned toward Ethan, his voice low. "They're unraveling, Ethan. This is the kind of pressure that makes systems crack." Ethan nodded but remained focused. He knew this moment wasn't just about Victor Hayes. It was about holding an entire institution accountable. The door to the conference room opened, and Marcus emerged, his expression unreadable. Victor followed behind him, his shoulders slumped and his face drawn. The two men approached Ethan and Andrew, the tension between them palpable. "Judge Carter," Marcus began, his tone formal, "on behalf of the Eastwood Police Department, I want to offer my sincerest apologies for what happened today. What Chief Hayes did was unacceptable, and I assure you there will be a full investigation." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his calm gaze meeting Marcus's. "I've heard those words before, Commissioner," he replied. "But words without action mean nothing." Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the point. "You have my word that this investigation will be thorough," he said. "And as of this moment, Chief Hayes is suspended pending the outcome." Victor's face tightened, but he said nothing. The humiliation of being publicly stripped of his authority was written all over him. Ethan didn't gloat or celebrate the announcement. Instead, he turned to Andrew, his expression thoughtful. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. Andrew nodded in agreement. "We'll make sure it doesn't end here." As the reporters continued to swarm the station, Ethan and Andrew made their way toward the exit. The cameras followed them, capturing every step. For Ethan, the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this moment, this small victory, was a reminder of what was possible when the truth came to light. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. Ethan paused for a moment, taking in the scene. Eastwood was a city of contradictions, a place where hope and despair coexisted in equal measure. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility. "Ready to take this to the next level?" Andrew asked, his tone light but resolute. Ethan glanced at his friend, a small smile breaking through his otherwise stoic expression. "Always," he replied. The two men walked away, their steps steady and purposeful. Behind them, the noise of the station faded, but the impact of what had happened inside would reverberate far beyond its walls. The station was a hive of chaos long after Ethan Carter and Andrew Bennett had walked out. Victor Hayes, now suspended, sat in stunned silence in a corner of the building, his mind swirling with desperation. He had built his career on intimidation and control, a strategy that had always worked for him. But now, for the first time, that foundation was crumbling beneath him. His thoughts darted to the phone calls he needed to make. Lawyers, colleagues, anyone who might help him salvage the mess he had created. Outside, Ethan and Andrew stood on the courthouse steps, a small but growing group of reporters surrounding them. Andrew, ever the skilled orator, stepped forward to address the press. Today's events are a glaring reminder of the systemic issues that plague our law enforcement agencies, he began, his voice steady and authoritative. What happened to Judge Carter is not an isolated incident. It is part of a broader pattern of abuse, one that has gone unchecked for far too long. We will not allow this to be swept under the rug. The reporters clamored to ask questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgency. "What are your next steps?" one of them managed to ask, her microphone pointed directly at Andrew. Andrew glanced at Ethan before answering. "We are filing a formal lawsuit against Chief Hayes and the Eastwood Police Department for abuse of power, unlawful detention, and racial discrimination. This case will shine a light on the practices that have been allowed to fester in this city, and we will demand accountability." Ethan, who had remained composed and silent thus far, finally stepped forward. The cameras focused on him, the quiet authority in his presence commanding attention. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about every person who has been wrongfully detained, humiliated, and dehumanized by those who are supposed to protect and serve. My position as a judge gave me a platform to fight back, but not everyone has that privilege. This fight is for them." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those gathered. The reporters continued to fire off questions, but Ethan and Andrew turned to leave, their message delivered. Back at Andrew's office later that evening, the two men sat across from one another, poring over legal documents. The lawsuit they were preparing wasn't just against Victor Hayes. It was a direct challenge to the Eastwood Police Department and the culture that had enabled him. Andrew tapped his pen against the table as he spoke. "We need to build a case that's not just about what happened to you, but about the broader implications, the systemic failures. If we can prove that this isn't an isolated incident, we can push for real reforms." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It won't be easy," he said. "The system is designed to protect people like Hayes, but we have to try. Too many people have suffered because no one was willing to take a stand." Andrew leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's why I'm glad you're leading this fight, Ethan. You bring credibility and integrity to the table. People will listen to you." Ethan gave a faint smile in return. "Let's hope so," he said. "Because this fight isn't just about the past, it's about the future. If we don't act now, nothing will change." Meanwhile, Victor's day had gone from bad to worse. Calls from his superiors and colleagues had been relentless, each one more damning than the last. His suspension had been made public, and the media frenzy surrounding the case was growing by the minute. Sitting in his dimly lit living room, Victor stared blankly at the television as news anchors dissected the situation. His face appeared on the screen, accompanied by phrases like abuse of power and racial profiling. Each headline felt like a blow, chipping away at the persona he had carefully cultivated over the years. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Reluctantly, he stood and opened it to reveal Lucas Hart, a defense attorney Victor had worked with in the past. Lucas was known for representing law enforcement officers in high-profile cases, and his arrival was a small glimmer of hope in Victor's otherwise bleak day. "Lucas," Victor said, stepping aside to let the man in. "Thank God you're here." Lucas entered, his expression unreadable as he set his briefcase on the coffee table. "Victor," he began, "I've been following the news. This is bad. Really bad." Victor sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "I know," he muttered. "But it's not as bad as they're making it out to be. I didn't know he was a judge. If I had known," Lucas held up a hand to stop him. "That's irrelevant," he said bluntly. "The fact that you didn't know doesn't absolve you of responsibility. The media isn't going to care about your intentions, and neither will the court. What matters is what you did and how it looks." Victor groaned, his frustration mounting. "So what do we do?" Lucas opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "We start by preparing your defense. You need to own up to your actions, but we'll argue that this was a procedural error, not malicious intent. The goal is damage control, minimizing the fallout as much as possible." Victor nodded reluctantly, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. He had spent years bending the rules to suit his agenda, confident that the system would always protect him. But now, the very system he had relied on was turning against him. Back at Andrew's office, the legal team worked late into the night, their determination unwavering. They sifted through records, uncovering patterns of misconduct within the Eastwood Police Department. Every detail, every incident of abuse added fuel to their case. Andrew glanced at Ethan, who was reviewing a document with furrowed brows. "How are you holding up?" Andrew asked, his tone gentle. Ethan looked up, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm fine," he replied. "This isn't just about me, Andrew. This is about justice for everyone who's ever been silenced." Andrew nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "We're going to make this count, Ethan. This isn't just a lawsuit, it's a reckoning." As the clock struck midnight, the team continued their work, fueled by a shared sense of purpose. Outside, the city of Eastwood slept, unaware of the storm that was brewing, a storm that would change everything. By morning, the story of Ethan Carter's wrongful arrest had spread beyond Eastwood, capturing the attention of national media outlets. Cable news networks ran footage of Ethan standing resolutely outside the police station, speaking about systemic injustice with calm authority. Social media was ablaze, with hashtags like Justice for Ethan and Reform Now trending across platforms. In living rooms, offices, and cafes, people from all walks of life debated the incident. Some were appalled by Victor Hayes' actions, calling them an abuse of power rooted in racial bias. Others, predictably, attempted to defend him, claiming he had been doing his job. But one fact was undeniable. The incident had struck a chord, bringing long-buried issues to the forefront of public consciousness. At Andrew Bennett's law firm, phones rang off the hook. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and even former victims of police misconduct reached out, offering support or sharing their own stories. The small office, usually a quiet hub of meticulous legal work, buzzed with activity. Andrew leaned against his desk, scrolling through an endless stream of emails. "Ethan," he said, glancing up, "this is bigger than we thought. People are rallying behind you. This case isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of them." Ethan, who sat across the room reviewing legal briefs, looked up thoughtfully. "That's why we can't lose focus," he replied. "This isn't just about making Hayes pay for what he did. It's about exposing the system that allowed him to act this way for so long." Andrew nodded. "We're gathering evidence, complaints filed against Hayes, patterns of misconduct within the department. Every piece of this puzzle will help build the case." Ethan's expression remained calm, but his resolve was evident. "It's time the system answers for itself," he said quietly. Across town, Victor Hayes sat in his dimly lit kitchen, his phone buzzing incessantly on the table. The headlines had been relentless, each one a fresh reminder of the public's outrage. "Police chief suspended after wrongful arrest of federal judge," read one. "Racial bias in Eastwood, a system exposed," blared another. Victor stared at the screen, his appetite gone. Every news segment featured Ethan Carter's composed yet powerful condemnation of the system, juxtaposed against clips of Victor's flustered attempts to fend off reporters. His face had become a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement, and he could feel the walls closing in. Lucas Hart, his defense attorney, sat across from him, sipping coffee as he reviewed a stack of papers. "The public pressure is mounting," Lucas said, not looking up. "We need to move fast if we're going to get ahead of this." Victor scoffed, bitterness seeping into his voice. "Get ahead of it? My career is over, Lucas. They've already decided I'm guilty. The court of public opinion doesn't care about facts." Lucas set the papers down, fixing Victor with a stern look. "The court of public opinion doesn't decide your legal fate. I do. But you need to cooperate, Victor. That means no more public statements, no more outbursts. Let me handle this." Victor nodded reluctantly, though the bitterness in his eyes remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost control, that his once dominant position was now nothing more than a memory. Meanwhile, Ethan and Andrew prepared for their first major press conference. The law firm's conference room had been transformed into a media hub, with reporters from major outlets setting up cameras and microphones. The air buzzed with anticipation as the clock ticked closer to the event. When Ethan stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Dressed impeccably in a dark suit, he carried himself with the quiet authority that had always defined him. Andrew stood nearby, a reassuring presence as Ethan prepared to address the room. "Good morning," Ethan began, his voice calm but resolute. "Thank you for being here today." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "What happened to me last week was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system that has allowed prejudice and abuse to thrive unchecked. For far too long, individuals in positions of power have used that power to demean, degrade, and dehumanize those they are sworn to protect." Ethan's words were measured but powerful, each one landing like a hammer blow. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their cameras capturing every moment. "This case is not just about me," Ethan continued. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I went through. And it's about demanding better from the institutions that are meant to serve us all." The room erupted in questions as Ethan stepped back, but Andrew quickly took the podium to manage the crowd. "We'll take a few questions," he announced, gesturing to a reporter in the front row. "Mr. Bennett," the reporter began, "what are you hoping to achieve with this lawsuit? Are you aiming for financial compensation or systemic change?" Andrew's gaze was steady as he responded. "This lawsuit is about justice. While financial damages may be part of the outcome, our primary goal is systemic reform. We want to expose the practices that allowed this incident to happen and ensure that they are addressed." Another reporter stood, her tone pointed. "Judge Carter, do you believe Chief Hayes should face criminal charges?" Ethan stepped forward again, his expression thoughtful. "That's not for me to decide," he said. "But I do believe that actions have consequences. If the investigation finds that Hayes violated the law, then he should be held accountable, just like anyone else." The press conference lasted nearly an hour, with Ethan and Andrew fielding questions about everything from police reform to racial bias. By the time it concluded, the narrative surrounding the case had shifted once again. Ethan wasn't just a victim. He was a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change. As the day progressed, public support for Ethan and his case grew. Community leaders organized rallies calling for police reform, while civil rights groups issued statements of solidarity. Across Eastwood, murals of Ethan began to appear, depicting him as a symbol of hope and justice. For Victor, the pressure was unbearable. His suspension had become indefinite, and whispers of a formal dismissal grew louder by the hour. His once loyal colleagues had distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations by associating with him. In a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control, Victor released a brief statement through his attorney. Chief Hayes acknowledges the gravity of recent events and is cooperating fully with the ongoing investigation. He remains committed to the principles of justice and fairness that have guided his career. The statement was met with widespread skepticism, with critics calling it hollow and insincere. For Victor, it was a futile effort to salvage his image, but the damage had already been done. Back at Andrew's office, Ethan reviewed the progress they had made. The lawsuit was gaining traction, and public pressure on the police department continued to mount. Yet Ethan knew this was just the beginning. "We've opened the door," Andrew said, leaning back in his chair. "Now we need to push it wide open." Ethan nodded, his resolve unshaken. "We're not just fighting for justice," he said. "We're fighting for change, and we won't stop until we get it." The lawsuit against Victor Hayes and the Eastwood Police Department was filed just days after the press conference. It marked a turning point in the city's history, a moment when the spotlight turned not just on one man's actions, but on the entire system that had enabled them. The legal document was meticulous, outlining a history of abuse, racial profiling, and systemic failures that went far beyond Ethan Carter's wrongful arrest. Bookmark. As the lawsuit gained traction, the Eastwood Police Department faced an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Internal investigations were launched, uncovering patterns of misconduct that had been ignored or swept under the rug for years. Complaints from citizens, long dismissed as isolated incidents, were revisited with fresh eyes. Each report painted a damning picture of a department that had operated with impunity, its officers emboldened by a lack of accountability. For Victor Hayes, the revelations were devastating. What had started as a single incident was now spiraling into a full-blown scandal, one that threatened to dismantle the career he had spent decades building. The media coverage was relentless, with headlines like Eastwood Police Under Fire and Abuse of Power in the Spotlight dominating the news cycle. In one particularly damning report, a former officer came forward, detailing a culture within the department that prioritized loyalty over justice. "We were told to look the other way," the officer said in a televised interview. "If a complaint came in about one of our own, it was our job to bury it." That's how Hayes operated, protecting the department at all costs, no matter who got hurt. The revelations fueled public outrage, sparking protests across Eastwood. Crowds gathered outside the police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "End police corruption." The movement was diverse, uniting people from all walks of life who shared a common demand for change. Inside the Eastwood courthouse, Ethan and Andrew worked tirelessly to build their case. Their team had grown, bolstered by volunteers and experts eager to contribute to the fight for justice. The evidence they uncovered was staggering. Internal memos, falsified reports, and testimony from whistleblowers painted a clear picture of a system in dire need of reform. Andrew stood at the head of a conference table, addressing the team. "This isn't just about winning a lawsuit," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about setting a precedent. If we can prove that the department operated with systemic bias and corruption, we can push for real, enforceable reforms. This is bigger than Hayes. This is about dismantling the culture that allowed him to thrive." Ethan nodded from his seat, his expression resolute. "We have to be thorough," he said. "This case isn't just about accountability. It's about creating a blueprint for change." The team divided the workload, each member tackling a specific aspect of the case. Some focused on gathering additional testimony, while others worked on analyzing department policies and identifying where they had failed. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, was a step closer to exposing the truth. Meanwhile, the Eastwood Police Department was in damage control mode. Commissioner Marcus Delaney, who had initially tried to distance himself from the scandal, found himself at the center of the storm. Under mounting pressure, he announced a series of immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for all officers and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review complaints. "We acknowledge that mistakes were made," Marcus said during a press conference, "and we are committed to making the changes necessary to restore public trust." The announcement was met with cautious optimism from some, but skepticism from others. Activists pointed out that promises of reform had been made before, only to be abandoned once the public's attention shifted. "Talk is cheap," one protester told a reporter. "We've seen this play out too many times. If they're serious about change, they need to back it up with action." Victor, now suspended indefinitely, spent his days in isolation. His once loyal colleagues had all but abandoned him, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Even Lucas Hart, his defense attorney, seemed increasingly distant, his confidence in Victor's case waning with each new revelation. "You need to prepare yourself," Lucas said during a tense meeting. "This lawsuit isn't going away, and the evidence against you is overwhelming. If you want any chance of salvaging what's left of your career, you need to cooperate fully with the investigation." Victor bristled at the suggestion, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. "I'm not going to roll over," he said defiantly. "I've done nothing wrong." Lucas sighed, his patience wearing thin. "That's not how the public sees it, Victor, and in cases like this, perception is everything." As the trial date approached, the atmosphere in Eastwood grew increasingly charged. The lawsuit had become a symbol of a broader fight for justice, one that extended far beyond the city's borders. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Ethan, using the case as a platform to push for nationwide reforms in policing. Ethan remained steadfast, his focus unwavering, even as the media scrutiny intensified. For him, this wasn't about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had. During a quiet moment in Andrew's office, Ethan reflected on the journey so far. "This case has brought out the best and worst in people," he said. "It's shown me how deep the problems run, but it's also reminded me of the power of community. People are standing up, demanding change. That gives me hope." Andrew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Change takes time," he said. "But this case is a start. We're showing people that the system can be challenged, that justice is possible. On the eve of the trial, Commissioner Marcus Delaney made a surprising announcement: the resignation of several senior officers, including Victor Hayes. The news sent shockwaves through the city, with many viewing it as a tacit admission of guilt. In a brief statement, Marcus said, "The actions of a few have cast a shadow over our department. By taking responsibility and stepping aside, these officers are allowing us to begin the process of rebuilding trust with the community." Victor's resignation was particularly notable, marking the end of a career that had once seemed untouchable. For Ethan and Andrew, it was a small but significant victory, a sign that the fight for accountability was bearing fruit. As the city braced for the trial, the mood in Eastwood was one of cautious optimism. The protests continued, the calls for reform growing louder with each passing day. For the first time in a long time, it felt like change was within reach. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, knew the road ahead would be difficult. But as he stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered in support, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly to Andrew. "But it's a start." Andrew smiled, clapping his friend on the shoulder. "And it's a damn good one," he said. The two men turned to enter the courthouse, ready to face the fight ahead. The battle for justice was far from over, but they were prepared to see it through to the end. The trial of Victor Hayes began under the intense glare of public scrutiny. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens eager to witness the outcome of a case that had come to symbolize a reckoning with systemic injustice. For Ethan Carter, the trial was not just about holding Victor accountable. It was about setting a precedent, a clear statement that no one was above the law. Victor, once a towering figure of authority in Eastwood, now looked diminished. Dressed in a dark suit that seemed too big for him, he sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn. His defense team, led by Lucas Hart, presented a strategy rooted in damage control. They framed Victor's actions as a momentary lapse of judgment, an error exacerbated by high-stress conditions. Bookmark, go back. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture. Armed with a mountain of evidence gathered by Ethan and Andrew Bennett's legal team, they laid bare a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond Ethan's arrest. Witnesses testified to Victor's history of targeting marginalized communities, his disregard for due process, and his use of power as a tool for intimidation. Among the most damning pieces of evidence was a series of internal emails that revealed Victor's disdain for the very people he was sworn to protect. In one message, he referred to a neighborhood as a cesspool that needed cleaning up, a chilling insight into the mindset that had guided his actions for years. One former officer took the stand, detailing the toxic culture within the department. Chief Hayes fostered an environment where power was prioritized over justice, the officer said. Anyone who questioned his methods was silenced or pushed out. He made it clear that the ends always justified the means. Victor's defense team attempted to counter by emphasizing his years of service, arguing that he had acted with the department's best interests in mind. But the evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment was firmly against him. Ethan sat quietly in the courtroom, his presence a steady reminder of why they were there. Throughout the trial, he maintained the same calm demeanor that had defined him since the beginning of this ordeal. For him, this wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that justice was served. When called to testify, Ethan spoke with clarity and conviction. "This case is not just about one man's actions," he said. "It's about a system that allowed those actions to go unchecked. What happened to me was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that we can no longer ignore." His testimony resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from those in attendance. Even the judge seemed moved, nodding slightly as Ethan concluded his remarks. As the trial progressed, Victor became increasingly isolated. The colleagues who had once supported him had turned their backs, unwilling to be associated with his tarnished reputation. His family, too, kept their distance, the strain of the scandal proving too much to bear. Lucas Hart, sensing the inevitability of defeat, urged Victor to consider a plea deal. "You need to think about the bigger picture," Lucas said during a tense meeting. "The evidence against you is overwhelming, If you plead guilty, you might salvage some dignity and avoid the worst penalties. Victor shook his head, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. I'm not a monster, he said defensively. I didn't do anything that others weren't doing. I'm being made an example of. Lucas sighed, his patience wearing thin. And that's exactly the point, he said. You are the example. Whether you like it or not, this trial is about more than just you. It's about the system you represent. If you don't take this deal, you're going to face the full weight of the law. Victor refused the deal, opting to take his chances with the verdict. When the day of judgment finally arrived, the courtroom was filled to capacity, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. The judge, a stern but fair woman with decades of experience, delivered the verdict with deliberate gravity. Victor Hayes, the court finds you guilty of abuse of power, misconduct, and racial discrimination. Your actions not only violated the rights of Judge Carter, but also eroded public trust in the very institution you were entrusted to uphold. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the sentence was announced. 5 years in prison, the maximum penalty for his charges. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a sign that justice could be achieved even in the face of systemic failures. Victor sat motionless as the verdict was read, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. The man who had once wielded power with impunity was now at the mercy of the very system he had manipulated for so long. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to await the outcome. When the news broke, cheers erupted. A collective release of tension that had built up over months of protests and advocacy. Activists hailed the verdict as a victory, not just for Ethan but for the entire community. Ethan and Andrew emerged from the courthouse to a flurry of camera flashes and questions from reporters. Ethan, ever composed, addressed the crowd with his trademark eloquence. Today's verdict is an important step toward accountability, he said. But it's only the beginning. The fight for justice doesn't end here. We must continue to demand better from our institutions to ensure that no one else has to endure what so many of us have. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices united in agreement. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the trial were felt across Eastwood and beyond. The Eastwood Police Department underwent sweeping changes, with several senior officers resigning or being dismissed. The newly formed Oversight Committee began reviewing complaints, ensuring that no allegation of misconduct would be ignored. Ethan, meanwhile, became a prominent voice in the movement for police reform. He spoke at rallies, met with lawmakers, and worked alongside civil rights organizations to push for meaningful change. His story resonated with people across the country, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Victor, now serving his sentence, faced the harsh reality of life on the other side of the justice system. The power and privilege he had once taken for granted were gone, replaced by the humbling experience of being held accountable for his actions. For Ethan, the journey was far from over. While he was heartened by the progress that had been made, he knew there was still much work to be done. The trial exposed deep flaws in the system, but it also showed what was possible when people united in pursuit of justice. Standing on the steps of the courthouse one evening, Ethan reflected on the road ahead. This isn't just about one case or one man, he said quietly. It's about creating a system that truly serves everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from. That's the fight worth fighting. Andrew, standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. And it's a fight we're going to win, he said with a smile. Ethan nodded, a determined glint in his eye. The battle for justice was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. Months after the trial concluded, Eastwood had transformed into a city in flux. The fallout from Victor Hayes' conviction triggered a chain reaction of reforms, protests, and conversations that many had thought impossible. What began as a single case of abuse of power had blossomed into a movement for justice that resonated far beyond the city's borders. The Eastwood Police Department, once untouchable in its authority, was now under intense scrutiny. The newly formed Oversight Committee had begun investigating past complaints, uncovering troubling patterns of misconduct that had long been ignored. Officers were required to attend rigorous bias training programs, and new policies were enacted to ensure greater transparency and accountability. For many residents, these changes felt like the first steps toward healing wounds that had festered for generations. For Ethan Carter, the months following the trial were a whirlwind of activity. He had gone from being a federal judge to a national figurehead for police reform and racial justice. Invitations to speak at events and conferences poured in, and Ethan embraced the opportunity to use his voice to advocate for change. At one such event, held in a packed auditorium at a prestigious university, Ethan addressed an audience of students, activists, and community leaders. Standing at the podium, he reflected on the journey that had brought him there. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "It happens every day, in every corner of this country, to people whose names we may never know. The difference is, I had the privilege and the platform to fight back. But this fight isn't just mine. It's ours." The audience listened intently as Ethan spoke about the systemic issues that had allowed someone like Victor Hayes to thrive. "This isn't just about bad apples," he said. "It's about the roots of the tree. We need to address the culture, the policies, and the systems that enable abuse and protect those who perpetrate it." As he concluded his speech, the crowd rose to their feet in applause, their faces a mix of inspiration and determination. Ethan had become more than a symbol of justice. He was a catalyst for action. Meanwhile, Andrew Bennett's law firm had become a hub for civil rights advocacy. The team that had worked tirelessly on Ethan's case now focused on similar lawsuits, representing clients who had been wronged by the system. The victory against Victor Hayes had emboldened others to come forward, sharing their stories and demanding accountability. Andrew's partnership with Ethan had deepened, their shared mission forging a bond that went beyond friendship. Together, they tackled not only individual cases, but also broader initiatives, lobbying for legislative changes and pushing for federal reforms. One evening, as they sat in Andrew's office reviewing a proposal for a new police accountability bill, Andrew glanced at Ethan and smiled. "You know," he said, "I don't think either of us imagined this is where we'd end up when this all started." Ethan chuckled softly. "No, I didn't," he admitted, "but I'm glad we're here. This work feels like what I was meant to do." Andrew nodded, a sense of pride evident in his expression. "And we're making a difference," he said. "One case at a time, one law at a time. It's slow, but it's progress." Back in Eastwood, the community continued to grapple with the changes brought about by the case. The protests had subsided, but the conversations they sparked remained. Schools incorporated lessons on civil rights and justice into their curriculums, and local organizations worked to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Even within the police department, a new culture was beginning to take root. Younger officers, inspired by the public's demand for accountability, approached their work with a renewed sense of purpose. They recognized that their role was not to control but to serve, to build trust rather than fear. One officer, a young recruit named Marcus Ray, reflected on the shift during an interview. "The Hayes case changed everything," he said. "It forced us to take a hard look at ourselves and what we stand for. I joined this force because I wanted to make a difference, and now I feel like I have a chance to do that." For Victor Hayes, the world he once knew had vanished. In prison, he experienced life on the other side of the justice system, a reality he had never imagined for himself. Stripped of his authority and influence, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions in a way that was both humbling and isolating. At first, Victor clung to his bitterness, blaming the system, the media, and even Ethan for his downfall. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to reflect on the choices that had brought him there. Conversations with other inmates, many of whom had been victims of the very abuses he had perpetuated, forced him to see the harm he had caused. In one particularly poignant moment, Victor spoke with an inmate who had been wrongfully arrested years earlier. "You never even looked at me," the man said, his voice tinged with both anger and sadness. "You just assumed I was guilty because of how I looked. Do you have any idea what that does to someone?" Victor had no answer. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions in a way that went beyond personal loss. It was a slow and painful reckoning, but one that was long overdue. Ethan, too, found moments of reflection amid the whirlwind of activity. One evening, as he walked through his old neighborhood, he was struck by how much and how little had changed. The streets were still familiar, the faces still recognizable, but there was a new sense of possibility in the air. A feeling that change, while slow, was within reach. Stopping at a small park where children played, Ethan watched as a young boy climbed a jungle gym with determined focus. The sight reminded him of his own childhood, of the dreams he had clung to despite the obstacles in his path. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Judge Carter?" Ethan turned to see a woman approaching, her face lit with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "What you did, it gave us all hope. My son looks up to you. He talks about becoming a lawyer someday because of you." Ethan smiled, his heart warmed by the woman's words. "Tell him he can do it," he said. "And tell him to never stop fighting for what's right." The legacy of the Victor Hayes case continued to ripple outward, touching lives and shaping conversations across the country. For Ethan, Andrew, and the countless others who had joined the fight, it was a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Standing on the steps of the courthouse one final time, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him there. The road had been long and difficult, but it had also been necessary. "Justice isn't just about punishment," he said in a speech to a gathered crowd. "It's about accountability. It's about making sure that what happened before doesn't happen again. And it's about creating a future where everyone, no matter who they are, is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices united in hope. As Ethan walked away from the courthouse that day, he knew the fight was far from over. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. Together they were building a better future, one step at a time. The story of Ethan Carter and Victor Hayes is more than a tale of injustice and reckoning. It is a mirror held up to society, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the systems that sustain them. At its heart, this narrative reminds us that justice is not just about holding individuals accountable. It is about dismantling the structures that enable abuse and creating pathways for lasting change. Ethan's journey serves as a powerful testament to resilience and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. His calm determination and unwavering commitment to fairness turned an act of humiliation into a catalyst for reform. The fallout from his ordeal revealed not only the deep flaws within the Eastwood Police Department, but also the potential for communities to come together and demand better. Victor Hayes, on the other hand, represents the dangers of unchecked authority. His downfall is a stark reminder that power without accountability leads to corruption. Yet even in his defeat, there are lessons to be learned about the necessity of reflection, the importance of empathy, and the possibility of redemption. This story is ultimately about hope. It shows us that change, while slow and arduous, is possible when people unite around shared values of justice and equality. It challenges us to remain vigilant, to speak up for those who cannot, and to hold our systems to the highest standards. Let it be a call to action, not just for those in positions of power, but for all of us. Each of us has a role to play in shaping a fairer, more compassionate world, whether through our actions, our voices, or our support for those fighting on the front lines. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did it inspire you? Did it resonate with your own experiences? If you thought the story was good, leave a comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, leave a comment with a 2. And remember, your voice matters too. Share your own stories with us in the comments below. We believe every voice has the power to inspire change. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss another meaningful story like this one. By sharing these narratives, we're creating a community rooted in justice, empathy, and hope. Let us know your thoughts below, and thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can build a better world, one story at a time.